For most of human existence, survival began with geography: water, shelter, elevation, and the edge of habitable land. Yet, Eden is remembered as a garden. The Dead Sea Scrolls do not give us a secret map, but texts preserved among them place Eden within a wider sacred landscape of mountains, rivers, boundaries, and human beginnings. What if something was lost when that landscape became only a garden? So, what do the Dead Sea Scrolls geography clues actually reveal about Eden? When people hear the words Garden of Eden, the mind usually creates a single picture. There is a garden, and that garden is Eden. Trees grow inside it, water passes through it, and the first humans live within its boundaries. The image is so familiar that the two words seem almost inseparable. Yet, the opening description in Genesis makes a distinction. It says that God planted a garden in Eden toward the east. The garden is therefore presented as something placed within Eden, not simply as another name for Eden itself. That difference is small enough to disappear in ordinary speech, but it matters if we are trying to understand the geography behind the story. In the same way, the wording allows Eden to be understood as a setting within which the garden occupied a place. This does not tell us how large Eden was, where its borders might have been, or whether its geography can be matched to a landscape. It only tells us that the text itself does not require the garden and Eden to be the same thing. That becomes more important a few lines later, when water enters the description. A river is said to flow out of Eden to water the garden, and afterward to divide into several branches. Once again, Eden appears beyond the garden in some sense, because the water comes from Eden and reaches the garden. The narrative is no longer describing only trees and human beings. It is describing movement through space. There is a source, a cultivated place, a direction, and then a network of rivers extending outward. For people living in the ancient Near East, such details belong to the practical structure of life. That does not mean the Eden story is a simple record of an actual prehistoric settlement. Genesis is an ancient religious and literary text, not a field report from humanity's earliest biological history, but its landscape is built from things ancient communities knew intimately: soil, water, plants, work, distance, and the difference between habitable ground and difficult ground. This is one reason the phrase Garden of Eden can mislead a listener. Over centuries, the garden became the dominant image. Eden itself remains less visually defined. Yet, if we return to the wording without adding later pictures, the story begins with a larger spatial frame. Eden is named as the place in which the garden is planted. The garden then becomes a location within that frame. The river connects Eden to the garden and then connects that water system to lands beyond it. Even before the story tells us much about human society, it places human beginnings inside a landscape organized by access to life-supporting resources. Modern paleoanthropology studies human origins through fossils, genetics, archaeology, and environmental evidence. It does not use Genesis to identify the birthplace of Homo sapiens. The Eden narrative belongs to a different kind of record, an ancient tradition about human beginnings, preserved and interpreted long after the emergence of our species. We should not collapse those forms of knowledge into one another. Yet we can still notice something deeply human in the structure of the story. When ancient people imagined a beginning, they imagined it somewhere. Origins needed ground beneath them. They needed water. They needed a boundary between one kind of place and another. Human memory often gives beginnings a landscape because life itself is never lived in empty space. Every generation begins somewhere, among particular rivers, soils, seasons, and roots. The first geographical clue in the Eden story, then, is not a hidden coordinate. It is a distinction sitting in plain sight. The garden is described as being in Eden. If that distinction is taken seriously, the question changes. Instead of asking only where the Garden of Eden was, we must first ask what kind of place the text meant when it spoke of Eden at all. To a modern listener, the word garden can suggest a peaceful enclosure made for beauty, leisure, or decoration. That picture is familiar, but it can quietly distort the older world behind the Eden story. In the ancient Near East, a garden was closely tied to water, labor, cultivated plants, shade, and the ability to create a productive place within a difficult environment. Gardens could certainly be beautiful, and elite gardens could display wealth or royal power, but they were not simply decorative lawns surrounded by flowers. They were controlled spaces in which human care and a reliable water supply allowed particular forms of life to grow. This matters because the garden in Genesis appears in a landscape where water is central from the beginning. The text does not describe Eden as an untouched wilderness that happens to contain trees. It describes a garden that is planted, watered, and associated with human responsibility. Those verbs move the image away from a modern park and towards something more structured. A cultivated place has boundaries, needs, and conditions. It depends on soil that can support growth and on water arriving often enough to keep plants alive. In much of the broader Near Eastern world, those conditions could not be taken for granted. Rainfall varied greatly from one region to another. Rivers could sustain settlements far beyond the areas where rain alone was sufficient, and irrigation helped make agriculture possible in places where seasonal dryness shaped daily life. None of this proves that the Eden story records one identifiable farming landscape. It does, however, help explain why water, trees, and cultivated ground carried such practical force for ancient audiences. They were not vague symbols floating outside ordinary experience. They belonged to the conditions that separated a livable place from a harsher one. For human beings, this difference has always mattered. Our species did not evolve in gardens, and archaeology does not identify a historical Eden. But every human population has depended on environments that provide enough water, food, shelter, and tolerable conditions to survive. Long before cities or written texts, people had to recognize where water could be found, which plants were useful, where animals gathered, and how seasons changed the landscape. The Genesis account is much later than those earliest stages of human history, yet it speaks through the same basic material world: ground that can be worked, plants that can grow, and water that makes continued life possible. This is why the garden should not be reduced to scenery. Its meaning begins in the relationship between life and place. A garden is not merely where the first humans stand, it is a place that has been made capable of supporting them. It is ordered rather than random, tended rather than ignored, and supplied rather than barren. That contrast becomes even clearer when the story later describes human life outside the garden, where work, ground, difficulty, and food remain central concerns. The narrative does not ask us to imagine human existence without dependence on the land. Instead, it places that dependence at the center of the story from its earliest moments. When later readers compressed Eden and the garden into one familiar image, much of this environmental structure became easier to overlook. Yet, the old description keeps bringing us back to practical geography. A garden must exist somewhere. Water must reach it from somewhere. Plants must grow under certain conditions. People inside it must interact with the ground. These are not enough to identify a location, but they prevent the setting from becoming completely abstract. Eden is remembered through a landscape that makes life possible, and the garden is one carefully described zone within that larger setting. Before asking whether any ancient text preserves a clue to where Eden was, it is therefore necessary to understand what kind of place the garden itself represented. It was not simply paradise in the modern sense of effortless beauty. It was a concentrated image of habitable land, where water, vegetation, work, and human life met in one controlled space. If the Eden story were concerned only with a perfect garden, it could have remained inside that enclosed image. It could have spoken only about trees, food, companionship, and the first human pair. Instead, the narrative begins to open outward. Water moves through the landscape. Rivers are named. Lands are mentioned. Direction enters the story. Even materials such as gold and aromatic substances appear beside place names. These details do not provide a modern map, yet they change the scale of the account. The garden is no longer an isolated scene. It stands within a wider world whose features can be described, compared, and remembered. This is important because ancient geography was not organized through satellite images, exact coordinates, or standardized maps. People understood space through rivers, routes, mountains, boundaries, neighboring peoples, travel time, and the resources associated with particular regions. A river could define where crops survived. A mountain range could separate communities. A desert could make movement difficult. A fertile valley could support generations of settlement. Geography was experienced through the body before it was measured on paper. The Eden narrative reflects that older habit of locating human life through environmental relationships. The text tells us where water comes from, how it moves, and which lands are connected to certain resources. That does not mean every detail can be matched securely to a modern location. Some names remain uncertain, and the river system described in Genesis does not fit neatly onto one simple contemporary map, but the presence of these details still matters. They show that the story of human beginnings was imagined within a structured landscape, not in a featureless paradise detached from the earth. For people throughout human history, beginnings have always depended on place. Our species emerged through long biological and cultural processes that modern science reconstructs from fossils, genetics, archaeology, and changing environments. Genesis does not preserve that scientific history, yet the story speaks through conditions that every human community has had to face. Water must be available, food must come from somewhere, movement follows terrain, and the usefulness of land differs from one region to another. When the narrative describes a river flowing out from Eden, it quietly places origin inside a network. Life begins in one place, but water moves beyond it. The world outside the garden is already present. This makes the geography more than decoration. It creates relationships between center and surroundings, inside and outside, source and destination. Those relationships will become important later, because other ancient Jewish texts also organize sacred history through places, boundaries, mountains, and inherited lands. But at this early point, there is no need to force the clues into a solution. The wiser approach is to notice what kind of question the text itself invites. It does not ask the reader to calculate latitude. It invites attention to how the world is arranged. Where does water begin? What lies beyond the cultivated place? Which lands are remembered by name? How does human life relate to the ground around it? These are geographical questions, but they belong to an ancient way of seeing geography. They combine practical observation with memory, identity, and meaning. This is why the first chapters of Genesis can feel both familiar and difficult. Some places sound real. Some rivers appear recognizable. Other features resist identification. The landscape seems close enough to invite comparison with the world we know, yet distant enough to prevent certainty. That tension is not a reason to invent missing evidence. It is a reason to read more carefully. Before the Dead Sea Scrolls can add anything to our understanding, we first have to see that Eden was already described as more than a garden. The story places human beginnings within a world of water, land, direction, and movement. And that wider frame is where the geographical puzzle truly begins. Its clues begin with relationships, not with hidden coordinates. The river is one of the first details that turns Eden from an image into a landscape. Genesis does not simply say that water was present, it describes movement. A river goes out from Eden to water the garden, and from there it divides. That sequence creates an important spatial relationship immediately. Eden is associated with a source. The garden receives water from that source. Beyond the garden, the flow becomes part of a wider system. Even without knowing where any of these places were, the reader is asked to imagine water passing through space. For ancient communities, that kind of movement would have been immediately meaningful. Rivers were not only features of scenery. They shaped where people could live, where fields could be cultivated, where animals could drink, and how settlements were connected. A reliable river could make the difference between land that supported generations and land that demanded constant movement. This practical reality does not prove that Genesis preserves a literal memory of one prehistoric river system. The text belongs to a much later literary and religious tradition. Yet, the story uses a form of geography rooted in ordinary human dependence on water. Life is placed near a source, and the source is not static, it moves outward. That pattern matters because human beings have always experienced water as both local and connected. A spring begins in one place, a stream joins another, and a river carries the effects of distant rainfall or melting snow into regions far away. Long before modern hydrology, people could observe that water had origins, directions, and consequences. They knew that a river arriving at a settlement had come from somewhere beyond the visible horizon. The Eden story speaks in that same basic language of source and flow. It does not provide measurements, elevations, or distances. It gives relationships. Water begins in Eden, reaches the garden, and then becomes several named waterways. This makes the garden part of a larger environmental network, rather than a sealed paradise existing apart from the earth. It also introduces a difficulty that will become increasingly important. If the river begins in Eden and later divides, then the geography cannot be understood simply by finding 4 modern rivers and tracing them backward as though the text were a contemporary map. River systems change over long periods. Names migrate from one place to another. Ancient writers also used geography for literary and symbolic purposes, as well as description. The safest starting point is therefore not to solve the river, but to observe what the river does inside the story. It connects the place of human beginnings to regions outside it. It makes water the first major element that crosses a boundary. The humans remain in the garden for a time, but the river does not. It carries the geography outward before the human story itself moves outward. That sequence has a quiet force. The landscape is already larger than the place occupied by the first pair. Their environment belongs to a world of sources, channels, distant lands, and resources beyond their immediate reach. In biological human history, access to fresh water repeatedly shaped where populations could survive and move, although no scientific evidence connects those ancient populations to a historical Eden. The connection here is more basic and more secure. Every human beginning takes place within environmental limits. Water is one of the strongest of those limits. By placing a flowing river near the beginning of its account, Genesis gives human origin a geography of dependence. The garden may appear protected and abundant, but even abundance has a source. Something must feed it. Something must cross into it. And once the water moves beyond it, the question of Eden can no longer remain confined to trees inside a garden. The river quietly asks us to look beyond the enclosure and toward the larger land from which life is supplied. Genesis names 4 rivers after describing the water that flows from Eden, and 2 of those names immediately seem more familiar than the others. The Tigris and the Euphrates are among the great rivers of Mesopotamia, and both are deeply embedded in the history of ancient Southwest Asia. Their presence gives the Eden account a strong geographical pull because they connect the story to a region that supported some of the earliest cities, states, irrigation systems, and written traditions known from the ancient world. Yet, familiarity can be misleading. Recognizing 2 river names does not mean the entire landscape can be reconstructed with confidence. The other 2 rivers, Pishon and Gihon, have never been identified in a way that commands broad agreement. Ancient and modern interpreters have proposed many possibilities, but none has become a secure solution. This is important because a map built from uncertain pieces can look more precise than the evidence really allows. The text also associates the Pishon with a land called Havilah and the Gihon with a land called Cush. Those names have histories of their own, and they do not function like modern country labels with fixed borders. Ancient place names could shift in meaning, refer to broad regions, or be remembered differently across generations. The same caution applies to rivers. A river name may survive for centuries, but channels can move, waterways can disappear, and later communities can reuse older names in new settings. None of this makes the text meaningless. It simply means that ancient geography must be read on its own terms. What we can say with reasonable confidence is that the Eden narrative places human beginnings inside a world connected to named lands and major waterways. 2 river names link that world to Mesopotamia, while the other 2 resist easy identification. That combination of familiarity and uncertainty is one reason Eden has attracted so many location theories. It seems close enough to known geography to invite reconstruction, yet incomplete enough to prevent a single answer from becoming secure. There is another reason for caution. In the description, one river flows from Eden and then becomes 4 heads or branches. That arrangement does not correspond neatly to the way the Tigris and Euphrates appear on a map. They are separate rivers that approach one another downstream, rather than branches visibly emerging from one known source. Ancient authors were not writing with modern hydrological categories, and the wording itself has been interpreted in different ways. The point is that recognition of 2 names does not solve the system. Human history offers many examples of communities organizing memory around rivers. Rivers carry food, people, sediments, trade, stories, and political boundaries. They can connect distant populations while also marking the edge between territories. In regions where rainfall is limited or seasonal, access to river water can shape settlement for generations. These realities help us understand why rivers belong so naturally in an ancient story about human origins, but they do not allow us to turn Genesis into a scientific record of the emergence of Homo sapiens. Fossils, archaeology, genetics, and environmental evidence tell that biological history. The Eden account preserves a different kind of memory, one in which origin is imagined through meaningful landscape. The 4 rivers therefore deserve careful attention, without being forced into certainty. The Tigris and Euphrates give us recognizable anchors. Pishon and Gihon remind us how much remains unclear. Havilah and Cush expand the horizon, but they do not provide coordinates. The result is a geography that reaches beyond the garden and toward a larger ancient world, while refusing to settle neatly onto a modern map. That refusal is not a gap we should fill with invention. It is evidence of the limits of what the text can tell us. Before asking where Eden was, we must first accept that some of its most famous geographical clues remain genuinely unresolved. The 4 rivers create the strongest temptation to turn Eden into a location problem that can be solved with a modern map. 2 names seem familiar, 2 remain uncertain, and the mind naturally tries to make them converge on one point. Yet, the closer we look, the more the system resists that kind of reconstruction. The Tigris and Euphrates do not simply emerge today as 4 branches from a single visible river flowing out of one known place. Their headwaters lie in broad upland regions, their courses have shifted over long periods, and the landscapes around them have been altered by sediment, climate, human engineering, and changing shorelines. Even if every ancient name could be matched securely to a modern waterway, the physical geography would still not remain frozen across thousands of years. Rivers are moving systems. They change channels, abandon old beds, cut new routes, and sometimes disappear from the surface entirely. That fact makes ancient river geography difficult, but it does not give us permission to invent missing connections. A dry channel found in Arabia or Mesopotamia may be historically interesting, yet it cannot be called Pishon or Gihon without evidence strong enough to support that identification. The same caution applies when interpreters use Havilah, Cush, minerals, or direction words to force the description into one preferred region. Each clue must be weighed separately before the pieces are combined. Ancient texts also did not always describe geography for the same reasons that modern maps do. A modern map aims to locate places through standardized scale, coordinates, and measurable distance. An ancient narrative could use rivers and lands to show extent, relationship, abundance, boundary, memory, or the shape of an inhabited world. A real river name could therefore appear beside a less certain region, without the author intending to provide a route that future readers could trace with precision. This possibility matters because Genesis places the first humans inside a meaningful world rather than inside empty space. The rivers extend the horizon beyond the garden. They connect the place of origin to lands known for resources and to waterways remembered across generations. In that sense, the geography succeeds even when it cannot be converted into a modern diagram. It tells the listener that human beginnings belong within a world of water, distance, land, and movement. That is also where the story quietly touches a much older truth about our species. Long before written traditions, human populations survived by learning landscapes in practical ways. They followed water, recognized seasonal changes, remembered routes, and passed knowledge of usable ground from one generation to another. We cannot claim that the Eden rivers preserve a direct memory from that deep prehistoric past. There is no accepted evidence for such a conclusion. But the narrative uses the same environmental realities that have always shaped human life. Water comes from somewhere, fertile ground has limits, and survival depends on knowing how places relate to one another. The difficulty begins when modern readers confuse that meaningful geography with a hidden technical map. Once that happens, every uncertain river becomes an opportunity for a dramatic claim, and every ancient name becomes a supposed coordinate. A more careful reading leaves the uncertainty visible. Tigris and Euphrates anchor the story to recognizable geography. Pishon and Gihon remain unresolved. Havilah and Cush broaden the world described, but their exact role in locating Eden is uncertain. The river system as a whole does not yield one location that scholars can demonstrate with confidence. This is not a failure of the investigation, it is the boundary of the evidence. And that boundary matters before we approach the Dead Sea Scrolls, because those texts are often treated as though they contain a missing key. What they can actually give us is subtler. They can show how ancient Jewish writers and readers imagined sacred places, inherited lands, mountains, boundaries, and beginnings. They can help us understand how Eden was placed inside a larger mental geography. But before those later traditions can be useful, the river puzzle has to remain what it is, a set of ancient geographical relationships that invites comparison with the real world without allowing a proven modern location. The Dead Sea Scrolls are often spoken about as though they were one mysterious book, hidden in the desert and waiting to overturn everything we thought we knew. The reality is quieter and far more useful. What was found in caves near Qumran was a large collection of ancient Jewish manuscripts and fragments, copied by different hands and preserving different kinds of texts. Some are copies of books later included in the Hebrew Bible. Others are prayers, legal writings, interpretations, community rules, hymns, calendars, wisdom texts, and works that expand stories already known from older scripture. They were written mainly in Hebrew and Aramaic, with some Greek, and they belong to the religious world of the Second Temple period. This matters for Eden because the scrolls do not give us a newly discovered version of human origins that simply replaces Genesis. Their value lies elsewhere. They allow us to see that ancient Jewish readers were not passive recipients of inherited stories. They copied them, interpreted them, organized them, argued about them, and sometimes expanded their geography and meaning. The caves therefore preserve not one voice, but traces of a wider textual culture. Even the idea that every manuscript came from a single isolated community is too simple. Some texts clearly reflect specific communal concerns, while others were already circulating more broadly in Jewish society. The collection contains material with different purposes, different styles, and different histories. For a question as delicate as the geography of Eden, that diversity is essential. We cannot take one phrase from one manuscript and treat it as though the entire Dead Sea Scrolls collection agreed on a secret location. Nor can we assume that a text copied near the Dead Sea describes events that were believed to have happened there. A manuscript has a place where it was deposited or preserved, but the world described inside it may stretch across generations and regions far beyond that cave. The desert setting can easily create the wrong impression. Dry cliffs, narrow openings, fragments of parchment, and ancient handwriting feel like the ingredients of a hidden revelation. Yet, preservation is not the same as secrecy, and discovery is not the same as proof. The importance of the scrolls comes from how much historical context they preserve. They show forms of biblical text older than the medieval manuscripts that scholars once depended on most heavily. They also preserve writings that help us understand how people in the centuries around the turn of the era thought about law, sacred time, community, angels, inherited land, and the distant past. That is where Eden slowly returns to our question. Human beings have always carried stories of beginnings forward through generations. But every generation receives those stories within a new landscape and a new social world. The earliest Homo sapiens left no written account of their own origins. Their deep history must be reconstructed through physical evidence. Much later, literate societies produced traditions that gave human beginnings moral, sacred, and geographical form. The Dead Sea Scrolls belong to that later process of preservation and interpretation. They cannot tell us where our species biologically began, and they cannot by themselves prove where Eden stood. What they can do is bring us closer to the ways ancient readers arranged the world around places they believed mattered. Before looking for mountains, boundaries, or inherited territories in those writings, we need to remember what kind of evidence we are holding. These are manuscripts, not satellite images. They preserve beliefs, readings, arguments, and memories. Used carefully, they can reveal how Eden fit inside an ancient mental landscape. Used carelessly, they can be made to say almost anything. The difference between those two approaches will determine whether the geography clues lead toward history or away from it. That distinction keeps inquiry useful for us. Scrolls become evidence for interpretation, instead of manufacturing certainty, where surviving texts leave questions open. One of the easiest mistakes to make with the Dead Sea Scrolls is to imagine that they revealed a hidden version of Genesis containing answers that have been lost from ordinary Bibles. That is not what the evidence shows. Among the manuscripts are ancient copies and fragments of Genesis itself, written centuries before the medieval Hebrew manuscripts that later became central to biblical study. These copies are extremely important because they let scholars compare older forms of the text and observe small differences in spelling, wording, and transmission. But they do not present a completely different creation story, in which Eden suddenly appears with a precise location. The broad structure of Genesis remains recognizable. Scholars can study textual variation among manuscripts, but variation is not the same thing as discovering an entirely separate account. An older manuscript is valuable because of its age and wording, not because age automatically turns every difference into a suppressed secret. Creation, the garden, the first humans, the flood, and the ancestral narratives are not replaced by an alternative book that overturns everything previously known. This distinction becomes especially important when other writings from the same manuscript world are brought into the conversation. The Genesis Apocryphon, for example, is not another copy of Genesis. It is an Aramaic work that retells and expands material connected with figures such as Noah and Abraham. Its existence shows that ancient Jewish writers could take inherited stories and elaborate them, adding speeches, details, explanations, or new perspectives. Jubilees does something similar in another way, reorganizing and expanding traditions from Genesis and Exodus within its own framework of sacred time, ancestry, and land. These writings can preserve ideas that help us understand how ancient readers imagined the world of the biblical stories, but they must not be confused with the biblical manuscripts themselves. A copy of Genesis, an interpretation of Genesis, and a later retelling related to Genesis are different kinds of evidence. When those categories are blurred, it becomes easy to claim that the scrolls revealed something that was actually part of an ancient interpretation rather than a lost line from Genesis. This matters for Eden because geography can enter at several levels. The biblical text already speaks of Eden, a garden, rivers, lands, and directions. Later, Jewish writings can take inherited geography and place it within larger systems of sacred places, territories, mountains, or ancestral boundaries. That expansion tells us something valuable about the way people in the Second Temple period understood older traditions. It does not automatically tell us where the original author of Genesis believed Eden was, and it certainly does not prove where a historical Eden existed. Human beings preserve stories by copying them, but they also preserve them by explaining them. Across generations, a familiar story can acquire new associations because each community hears it from within a different political, environmental, and religious world. This is a normal feature of cultural memory. It is also why the Dead Sea Scrolls are so important. They bring us closer to a period when biblical traditions were being copied with great care while also being actively interpreted. The scrolls therefore give us layers rather than a single hidden answer. One layer preserves ancient forms of Genesis. Another shows how related stories could be retold. Another reveals how writers thought about sacred land and human history. For the question of Eden, those layers must remain separate before they can be compared. Otherwise, a later interpretation can be mistaken for an original geographical clue, and a literary expansion can be treated as archaeological evidence. The safer conclusion is less dramatic, but far more useful. The Dead Sea Scrolls did not uncover a secret Genesis that identifies Eden for us. They preserved older witnesses to Genesis, alongside other works that show how ancient Jewish readers continue to think about beginnings, places, and the shape of the world. The mystery, therefore, does not become simpler. It becomes more historically precise. Around Genesis in the Dead Sea Scrolls stands a wider family of writings that helps us see how ancient Jewish readers thought with inherited stories, rather than merely repeating them. 3 names are especially useful here: Jubilees, Enoch, and the Genesis Apocryphon. They are not interchangeable, and they do not all treat Eden in the same way. What connects them is that they preserve a world in which the distant past could be expanded, organized, and interpreted through new patterns of time, place, ancestry, and sacred order. Jubilees retells large portions of Genesis and the opening of Exodus, while arranging events within a carefully structured calendar. It repeatedly connects people to lands, mountains, boundaries, and inherited territories. That makes it especially important for a geographical question, not because it gives us a modern map of Eden, but because it shows that some ancient Jewish writers understood sacred history through spatial relationships as well as through events. Enoch belongs to a different collection of traditions. Aramaic copies of Enochic writings were found among the Qumran manuscripts, confirming that these works circulated in the Second Temple period. Their landscapes can include mountains, distant regions, cosmic journeys, and places associated with judgment or holiness. These descriptions are significant for understanding ancient imagination, but they cannot simply be treated as ordinary travel reports. Some of their geography is visionary or symbolic, and its purpose may be theological rather than cartographic. The Genesis Apocryphon offers another kind of window. Written in Aramaic, it retells and expands stories connected with figures such as Noah and Abraham. Familiar biblical episodes are narrated with added speeches, details, and perspectives. The work shows how an inherited story could remain recognizable while becoming fuller in the hands of a later writer. Together, these writings help explain why the geography surrounding Eden cannot be studied by looking only for a missing river name. Ancient readers were capable of placing old stories inside larger systems of meaning. A mountain could be more than elevated ground. A boundary could carry ancestral significance. A land could be remembered through the family believed to inherit it. A direction could take on a moral or sacred pattern. None of this means that every geographical statement was symbolic. It means that physical place and religious meaning were often allowed to exist together. For the history of human beings, that combination is familiar in another sense. Communities do not remember landscapes only as measurements. They remember where ancestors lived, where water was found, where danger began, where burial grounds stood, and which paths led home. Over generations, geography becomes woven into identity. We should not project the specific beliefs of these Second Temple writings back into the deep prehistoric lives of early Homo sapiens. There is no evidence that would justify such a step, but these texts do show something historically observable about later human societies. Places can carry layers of memory that exceed their physical shape. This will become important when Eden begins to appear beside other sacred locations in ancient Jewish interpretation. If a writer places Eden in relation to mountains, holy places, or divisions of land, the first question should not be whether we have discovered its coordinates. The first question should be what kind of world that writer is organizing. The manuscripts from Qumran give us access to several answers, not one. They preserve older scripture beside writings that reinterpret beginnings through different structures. That wider textual environment is the real clue. It shows that Eden could remain a place in ancient thought while also entering a sacred geography whose meaning depended on relationships between locations. Understanding those relationships is more reliable than pretending that one of these writings quietly preserved a secret map that everyone else failed to notice. The next step, then, is to follow one of those relationships carefully. How Jubilees places Eden within a broader pattern of sacred places, inherited land, and remembered centers. When Jubilees retells the story of human beginnings, Eden remains a garden, but it does not remain only a garden. The work takes traditions already known from Genesis and places them inside a larger pattern of sacred time, sacred places, and inherited land. This matters because the geography of Eden begins to carry a different weight. In Genesis, the garden is planted in Eden, watered by a river, and surrounded by a wider world of named lands and waterways. Jubilees keeps that inherited setting, yet it also describes the Garden of Eden in language associated with holiness. At one point, it calls the garden the Holy of Holies and the dwelling of the Lord. That phrase does not give us a coordinate. It does not tell us that archaeologists should search for a building, altar, or ruined sanctuary hidden beneath some modern landscape. It tells us how the author ranked the place within a sacred order. Eden is no longer important only because the first humans were placed there. It becomes a location marked by a special degree of holiness. That distinction helps us understand why searching only for rivers can miss some of what ancient readers were doing with the story. A place could be meaningful because of where it stood, but also because of what role it occupied within a religious map of the world. Jubilees makes this especially clear by placing Eden among several locations that receive exceptional status. Elsewhere, the work names the Garden of Eden together with the Mount of the East, Mount Sinai, and Mount Zion as places belonging to the Lord. Later, Eden, Sinai, and Zion are described in relation to one another as holy places. The text does not simply collapse them into one location. Their importance also lies in their relationship. Eden belongs within a pattern. This is a very different kind of clue from a river channel or a mountain range identified by modern surveying. It is a clue to ancient spatial thinking. A sacred landscape can have centers, boundaries, privileged regions, and places that stand in meaningful relation even when they are physically separated. Human communities have repeatedly organized space in this way. A spring may be valuable because it provides water, while a mountain may also be remembered because ceremonies, ancestors, or stories are attached to it. The physical and the remembered landscape can exist at the same time. That observation should not be projected backward into the biological beginnings of Homo sapiens. We have no evidence that the earliest members of our species knew the Eden traditions preserved much later in Jewish literature. Their origins are reconstructed through fossils, genetics, archaeology, and environmental evidence. Jubilees belongs to another historical layer, one in which later societies were asking what the inherited stories of human beginnings meant for their own understanding of the world. That layer is valuable precisely because it can be studied without confusing it with prehistory. Eden in Jubilees therefore becomes more than vegetation, abundance, or an enclosed garden. It becomes an element within an ordered sacred geography. Yet, even here, caution is essential. Calling Eden a holy place does not prove that the writer possessed lost geographical knowledge about where it once stood. Sacred status and physical location are not the same question. A community may describe a place with absolute religious confidence while leaving its measurable position uncertain. What Jubilees gives us is evidence for interpretation, not a hidden survey. It shows that at least some ancient Jewish readers could imagine Eden as a real place within their sacred world, while also giving it a status that exceeded ordinary geography. That shift is important. The question is no longer only whether 4 rivers can be matched to modern waterways. We must also ask how Eden was positioned within a network of holy places, and why an ancient writer thought those relationships mattered for understanding humanity's remembered beginning. A striking feature of Jubilees is the way it places Eden beside other places of exceptional holiness without saying that they are physically the same location. In its description of the world inherited by the descendants of Noah, the work names the Garden of Eden, Mount Sinai, and Mount Zion together. Eden is described as the Holy of Holies and the dwelling of the Lord. Sinai stands in the midst of the desert. Zion stands in the midst of what the text calls the navel of the earth. The three are said to have been created as holy places facing one another. That language is important because it changes the kind of geography we are dealing with. A modern reader may instinctively ask how many kilometers separate these places, or whether a straight line can be drawn between them. Jubilees is doing something different. It is arranging sacred space through rank and relationship. Eden, Sinai, and Zion become connected because each occupies a privileged position in the author's understanding of divine history. Their connection does not require them to be adjacent, and nothing in the passage allows us to identify Eden with either Sinai or Jerusalem. This distinction protects the evidence from a common mistake. When ancient writers connect places symbolically or theologically, modern readers sometimes collapse those relationships into physical identity. But a sacred center can correspond to another sacred center without being the same mountain, valley, or city. In Jubilees, Sinai is associated with revelation and covenant. Zion is associated with the chosen sanctuary and the center of sacred history. Eden reaches farther back, to the remembered beginning of human life and to a place described with the language of supreme holiness. Together, they form a pattern extending from origins, through revelation, toward the sacred center known to later Israelite tradition. That pattern is historical evidence for how one ancient Jewish author organized meaning across space. It is not evidence that the author possessed a lost survey of the ancient world. The phrase about these places facing one another is especially easy to overread. It may sound like a directional clue, but the text does not provide bearings, distances, or a route between them. Scholars therefore discuss it as part of the sacred geography of Jubilees, rather than as a set of coordinates. What matters is the ordered relationship among holy locations. This way of imagining the world has deep parallels in human experience. Communities often distinguish an ordinary landscape from a landscape filled with remembered significance. A hill can be important because ancestors gathered there. A river crossing can mark a boundary between groups. A distant mountain can become central to identity, even for people who rarely see it. None of these meanings changes the physical geology of the place, yet they change how generations understand where they belong. We should not project the specific map of Jubilees backward into prehistoric humanity. The earliest Homo sapiens left no texts describing Eden, Sinai, or Zion. Their movements and environments are reconstructed through archaeology, genetics, fossils, and climate evidence. But by the time texts such as Jubilees were written and copied, human societies had long been using places to organize collective memory. That is the level at which these clues become reliable. Eden is not simply where a garden once stood in the story. It participates in a network of sacred centers through which an ancient writer connected human beginnings with later moments of covenant and worship. This helps explain why the Dead Sea Scrolls matter without making them say more than they do. Manuscripts of Jubilees found at Qumran preserve evidence that this way of arranging sacred history circulated in the world of Second Temple Judaism. They do not prove that Eden has been located. They show instead that some ancient readers imagined Eden within a geography of holiness, where meaning depended not only on rivers and land, but also on how one sacred place was related to another across remembered time. Sacred geography begins when a landscape is understood not only by distance, direction, and terrain, but also by meanings assigned to particular places. Jubilees gives a clear example of this way of organizing the world. The text describes lands divided among the descendants of Noah, identifies boundaries, names, mountains, and regions, and places locations within a hierarchy of holiness. Eden belongs inside that larger arrangement. It is not simply remembered as the setting of the first humans. It is treated as a privileged place whose importance can be understood only in relation to other places that carry sacred roles. This does not make the geography unreal. The lands, mountains, and directions named by ancient writers often belong to the physical world they inherited through tradition. But physical geography and sacred meaning could overlap. A mountain could be real ground and also a place where revelation was remembered. A city could occupy measurable land and function as a center of collective identity. A boundary could separate territories while expressing a story about ancestry and inheritance. In Jubilees, this overlap helps explain why Eden can be discussed beside Sinai and Zion without becoming identical to either. The author is arranging importance across space. Some locations stand closer to the sacred center of the story than others, even when geographically separated. This differs from a modern map, where every place is represented according to the same measurable system. On a road map, a river, village, and mountain are located by position. In a sacred geography, they may also be ranked by memory, holiness, ancestry, or connection to foundational events. That distinction matters when we ask what the Dead Sea Scrolls can contribute to the question of Eden. A reader searching only for a hidden coordinate may overlook historical evidence. Some ancient Jewish writers were interested in how sacred history was distributed across land. Jubilees also locates families within territories and places special sites within an ordered world. Space becomes one way of expressing belonging. For human communities, this relationship between land and identity is not unusual. People often inherit places through stories before they understand them through measurement. A child may know where a family came from because a river, hill, or village appears repeatedly in older memories. Over time, those places can become symbols of origin, even when descendants live elsewhere. Human beings have depended on landscapes since long before writing. Although we cannot know how the earliest Homo sapiens described their own places, or whether they possessed anything resembling the sacred geography preserved in much later texts. Archaeology can trace settlement, movement, tools, food remains, and changing environments, but it rarely gives us the words people use to organize meaning. Written traditions provide that layer for much later societies. Jubilees belongs to that layer. Its geography shows a world in which territory, genealogy, holiness, and remembered beginnings are connected. This helps us understand Eden without pretending to locate it. Eden can occupy a central place in the author's mental world, even if its measurable position remains uncertain. Its importance can come from relationship rather than coordinates. That also explains why boundaries matter. A sacred center becomes meaningful partly because there is an outside. An inherited land becomes meaningful because it has edges. A holy place gains distinction because ordinary places surround it. Eden, Sinai, and Zion therefore form more than a list of names. They reveal a habit of arranging history through space. Once we recognize that habit, the geographical clues become more useful. They no longer promise a secret map. Instead, they show how one ancient tradition connected the remembered beginning of humanity with a world of sacred centers, inherited territories, and meaningful boundaries. From there, another question emerges. If sacred places are arranged through centers and relationships, why do mountains and elevated places appear so often when ancient societies imagined where heaven, water, and human history seem to meet? Mountains often become important in ancient religious landscapes for a simple physical reason. They rise above the places where ordinary life takes place. From a valley or plain, a mountain changes the horizon. Its summit can disappear into cloud, receive snow while lower ground remains dry, or stand visible from great distances. Ancient communities did not need modern geology to notice that elevated places seemed different from the land around them. In many traditions of the ancient Near East, mountains became associated with divine presence, revelation, temples, or the ordering of the world. This pattern appears in different forms and should not be reduced to one universal belief, but it helps explain why elevated places repeatedly enter sacred geography. Mesopotamian temple towers known as ziggurats created artificial height within flat urban landscapes, and the great sanctuary of Enlil at Nippur was called Ekur, a name commonly understood as mountain house. In the Hebrew Bible, Sinai is remembered as the mountain of revelation, while Zion becomes a central sacred place in Jerusalem. Later, biblical imagery can also connect Eden with mountain language. Yet, an important boundary must remain clear. The garden narrative in Genesis does not actually say that Eden stood on a mountain. It describes a garden, a river, trees, land, and directions. but it gives no explicit statement that the garden occupied a summit. Any attempt to place Genesis's Eden on high ground therefore moves beyond what that account directly tells us. The attraction of the idea becomes easier to understand when water is considered. Rivers have sources, and many major waterways descend from uplands. A reader looking at the statement that a river goes out from Eden may naturally imagine a higher source feeding lower lands, but natural plausibility is not textual proof. Ancient writers could describe water through inherited geographical ideas, and the hydrology of the 4 Eden rivers remains too uncertain to reconstruct one landscape confidently. This distinction matters because human beings have always learned the shape of land through survival. Long before written religion, populations needed to know where water collected, where slopes became difficult, where seasonal streams returned, and where high ground offered visibility or access to different resources. Archaeology can sometimes recover traces of those movements, but it cannot tell us that prehistoric people understood mountains in the same sacred terms found in much later texts. The safe connection is more basic. Elevation affects water, travel, climate, vegetation, and the way a landscape is experienced by the body. Later, societies could then add layers of memory and religious meaning to those physical features. Jubilees shows such a layer clearly. It names Sinai and Zion as holy places and places Eden within the same ordered sacred world. That does not mean Eden must be another mountain hidden somewhere between them. It means that the author thought about sacred history spatially, using places that carry different forms of holiness. Mountains fit naturally into that pattern because they already stood out in both physical and cultural landscapes. They could mark boundaries, dominate routes, hold sanctuaries, or become visible symbols of a community's remembered relationship with the divine. The danger comes when symbolism is turned into coordinates. A mountain mentioned in a later tradition is not automatically the mountain of Eden, and a highland river source is not automatically the source described in Genesis. The evidence allows us to say that elevated sacred places were important in several ancient Near Eastern and biblical traditions. It also allows us to observe that later texts could place Eden within networks of holy locations. What it does not allow is a confident statement that Genesis intended Eden to be a mountain sanctuary. That uncertainty is useful because it keeps the geographical question open. Instead of asking which mountain must have been Eden, we can ask why later readers found it natural to imagine human beginnings in relation to elevated, watered, and sacred places, and what that tells us about the way landscapes became carriers of memory. The idea of a river flowing out from Eden creates a natural question about elevation. Water moves downhill, and many of the great rivers known to ancient peoples begin in uplands, where rain and snow feed streams that gradually join into larger channels. The Tigris and Euphrates both rise in the highlands of what is now eastern Turkey before descending toward the plains of Mesopotamia. Because Genesis connects Eden with the source of a river, later readers have sometimes looked toward mountainous regions north of Mesopotamia as possible settings for the story. The reasoning is understandable, but it remains only a possibility. Genesis never says that Eden stood among the headwaters of the Tigris and Euphrates, nor does it explain the elevation of the garden. The description gives us relationships between water and land, not the measurements needed to reconstruct a watershed. Even the statement that one river became 4 heads is difficult to compare directly with modern hydrology. Rivers normally gather water from smaller tributaries as they descend, whereas the Eden account can sound as though one stream separates into several major waterways. The Hebrew wording has been discussed in different ways, and the physical landscape itself has changed across long periods. So the safest approach is to resist turning a literary sequence into an engineering diagram. Ancient people knew rivers through experience. They saw water arrive from distant regions, watched floods transform fields, and understood that major rivers could begin beyond the horizon in landscapes they might never visit. For communities living on the Mesopotamian plains, the upper courses of great rivers belonged to another environmental world. Water descended from higher country into flatter lands where irrigation, settlement, and agriculture depended on its continued flow. That contrast between source and cultivated plain may help us understand why a river beginning somewhere beyond the garden could carry such force in a story about human beginnings. Yet it does not identify Eden. The same caution applies when mountains are introduced through later traditions. If Eden is associated with holiness, and if holy places such as Sinai and Zion are mountains, it may be tempting to imagine a lost sacred mountain from which the four rivers once flowed. But that picture combines separate clues that the surviving texts do not themselves combine so clearly. A plausible image is not the same as historical evidence. For the biological history of our species, water sources and elevation mattered in much more practical ways. Human populations could follow river valleys, gather near springs and lakes, and move as climates changed the availability of water. Archaeological sites often cluster around landscapes that once provided dependable resources. But those observations belong to the study of human adaptation, not to proof of Eden. We cannot take a general truth about human survival and use it to authenticate a particular sacred narrative as prehistoric geography. What we can do is recognize why water flowing from a source would make intuitive sense to ancient listeners. Life depends on water arriving from somewhere. A fertile region is connected to places beyond itself. The visible field may depend on rain that fell far away, on snow that melted in distant hills, or on a river whose upper reaches were known only through travelers and inherited knowledge. In that sense, the Eden River preserves a very human way of thinking about landscapes. What sustains us often begins outside the place where we live. The river therefore encourages us to imagine connection rather than isolation. Eden supplies water to the garden, and the water then reaches beyond it. Whether that structure reflects real geography, symbolic geography, or a combination that cannot now be separated, remains uncertain. The important point is that elevation alone cannot solve the puzzle. A highland source may fit one aspect of the description while failing to explain others. The Tigris and Euphrates may pull our attention northward, while Pishon and Gihon prevent a simple reconstruction. Mountains may help us understand ancient ideas about sacred centers, but Genesis does not explicitly place Eden on one. The evidence keeps leading us toward relationships rather than coordinates. Water has a source, the garden depends on it, and the wider world receives its flow. That is enough to make geography central to the story, without pretending that the river has finally shown us where Eden was. The image of water leaving Eden and moving outward gives the story a sense of direction that is easy to overlook. The garden is not presented as a place sealed off from the rest of the world. Its water comes from a source associated with Eden, passes through the cultivated space, and then continues beyond it. In that movement, life appears to spread outward from a center. The idea is simple enough to feel natural. A spring feeds a stream feeds fields, and those fields support people, animals, and plants. Ancient communities did not need a scientific theory of ecosystems to understand that water could transform land. They could see the difference between dry ground and watered soil with their own eyes. They knew that a river could sustain settlements far from the place where the water first entered the landscape. That practical knowledge gives the Eden River a quiet force. The garden is abundant, but its abundance is not described as independent of geography. It depends on flow. It depends on connection. It depends on a source beyond the immediate space occupied by the first humans. This does not mean that Genesis is describing a literal hydrological center from which all life on Earth once spread. The text does not say that, and modern geology does not identify such a place. What the narrative does show is a pattern in which life-supporting water moves from a privileged place toward a wider world. That pattern appears in other ancient traditions as well, where sacred centers are imagined as places from which order, fertility, or blessing extends outward. The similarity helps us understand ancient ways of organizing meaning, but it cannot by itself identify Eden. For the history of our species, the deeper connection is environmental rather than theological. Human populations have always depended on unevenly distributed resources. Fresh water, edible plants, animals, shelter, and tolerable climates are never spread uniformly across a landscape. People survive by moving toward places where those conditions overlap. Over long periods, river valleys, lake shores, springs, and seasonal wetlands repeatedly became important zones of occupation. Archaeology can sometimes recover traces of these patterns, but it cannot tell us that any one of them was remembered as Eden. The safest observation is that human origins, like all human life, unfolded within ecological limits. The Eden story gives those limits a literary shape. Water is not an ornament beside the garden. It is part of the reason the garden can exist. Once that is understood, the image of Eden begins to change again. It is no longer only a protected enclosure filled with trees. It becomes part of a larger system in which a source, a cultivated place, and surrounding lands are connected by water. That larger system may help explain why later Jewish writers could imagine Eden as more than a single garden. A place associated with beginnings could also become a sacred center in memory, especially if life itself was imagined as flowing outward from it. Yet the distinction between memory and geography remains essential. A sacred center can organize a worldview without occupying the center of a modern map. A river can symbolize abundance while still being described through real features of ancient landscapes. The two possibilities do not cancel each other, and they do not need to be forced into one answer. What matters is the relationship. Eden is remembered as a place from which water moves, the garden receives that water, and the world beyond becomes connected to the same flow. That pattern is enough to make Eden feel larger than an enclosed paradise. It becomes a point of origin within a spatial network, a place imagined through dependence, movement, and connection. The geography still refuses to give us coordinates, but it gives us something more durable, a way of seeing human beginnings as rooted in a landscape where life can continue only because resources move from one place to another. After the flood, the world of Jubilees becomes increasingly organized through land. The descendants of Noah are not simply listed as generations moving forward in time. They are connected to territories, boundaries, and inherited portions of the earth. In the account, Noah's sons receive their shares by lot, and those shares are then described through coastlines, mountains, rivers, and named regions. This is not the same kind of map we would draw today. There are no coordinates, standardized distances, or scales. The geography is instead built from relationships between people and places. A family line belongs to a territory. A boundary separates one inheritance from another. A mountain or sea can mark the edge of a remembered domain. In this way, geography becomes part of genealogy. The world is not only divided into lands, it is divided among descendants. That connection matters because it gives space a generational structure. Land can be remembered as something received, assigned, protected, and passed forward. Jubilee strengthens this idea by treating the boundaries as serious obligations. The portions are not presented as casual descriptions of where people happen to settle. The text gives them moral weight, and later, movement across those inherited limits can become a problem within the story. This tells us something important about the author's worldview. Territory is not empty ground waiting to be occupied. It is part of an ordered history. The earth is imagined as a place where ancestry and location belong together. That perspective helps us understand why Eden can fit into the same wider geography. Eden is not one isolated location floating outside human history. It stands within a world that is being arranged through sacred places, inherited regions, and remembered boundaries. The story of human beginnings therefore connects naturally to the story of human dispersal. One begins with a garden and a source of water. The other expands into a world divided among generations. For real human populations, movement across landscapes has always shaped history. But we must keep the kinds of evidence separate. Archaeology, genetics, and environmental studies can show how populations migrated, mixed, adapted, and settled over long periods. Jubilees does not provide that scientific record. Its division of the world after Noah belongs to a literary and religious understanding of ancestry. Yet, the text still reveals something historically meaningful about the society that produced and preserved it. People could imagine identity geographically. To know who belonged to a lineage was also to know which land that lineage was associated with. That way of thinking is familiar across many ancient societies, where ancestry, territory, and political claims often reinforced one another. But the specific boundaries in Jubilees should not be treated as neutral historical borders that can simply be transferred onto a modern atlas. They belong to the author's interpretation of the world. Some places may correspond to real regions known in antiquity, while the complete arrangement reflects the purposes of the text itself. This distinction becomes essential when Eden is discussed within the same system. If the author assigns sacred importance to Eden and also divides the inhabited world among Noah's descendants, we are looking at an ordered mental landscape, not at a lost cartographic archive. The geography is meaningful because it explains relationships, who belongs where, which places are holy, which boundaries matter, and how the world after catastrophe is structured for future generations. In that sense, Noah's divided world marks a major shift from the earlier Eden story. Human beginnings were first placed within a garden supported by water. Now human history spreads across territories that must be named, inherited, and remembered. The center has given way to many regions, yet the memory of special places remains inside the larger map. What begins as a story about one protected place has become a story about a populated Earth whose divisions carry meaning across generations. That transition will matter when we ask why borders in Jubilees are treated so seriously, and how crossing them can become more than a question of travel. Once the Earth has been divided among Noah's descendants in Jubilees, the boundaries begin to matter as much as the territories themselves. A border in this world is not merely a line separating one region from another. It marks an inheritance, a relationship between a family and a place, and an obligation carried forward through generations. The text describes Noah's sons and grandsons receiving portions of land, and then binds those arrangements with oaths. That detail gives geography a moral dimension. To cross into another family's allotted territory is not presented simply as movement across open ground. It can become a violation of an inherited order. This helps explain why the story of Canaan receives special attention. Jubilees portrays Canaan as taking land associated with Shem's portion, rather than remaining within the territory assigned to his own family line. The narrative then treats that choice as a breach of the earlier division. Whatever we think about the historical claims behind this arrangement, the literary purpose is clear. Boundaries are being used to explain who belongs where and why possession of land matters. They turn genealogy into geography. A family history becomes visible on the ground. For ancient societies, this connection between ancestry and territory was familiar. Land could support crops, herds, water access, roads, and settlements, but it could also preserve memory. A valley might be known through the people who lived there. A mountain could mark the edge of one community's territory. A river might separate neighboring groups while also connecting them through trade and travel. When such features are remembered across generations, geography becomes part of identity. Jubilees takes that human tendency and gives it a strongly ordered form. The world after the flood is not random space. It is divided, named, inherited, and morally interpreted. This does not mean that the boundaries described in the work can be laid directly over a modern political map. Ancient geographical names were not always precise. Territories changed, and the author had theological and communal purposes, as well as geographical interests. The borders tell us most securely how the writer wanted the world to be understood, not exactly where every ancient frontier once stood. That distinction is important for Eden. If Eden appears inside the same mental world, then its significance may also depend partly on relationships rather than on coordinates. A sacred place can be defined by what surrounds it, who is associated with it, and how it fits into a remembered order. The garden at humanity's beginning was already separated from what lay outside. Later, the earth itself becomes divided among generations. In both cases, a boundary creates meaning by distinguishing one space from another. Human biological history was far less orderly. Populations moved, mixed, separated, and met again over immense periods, often without fixed borders of the kind later states would recognize. Archaeology and genetics reveal mobility and interaction, rather than a world permanently divided into ancestral territories. We should therefore not treat jubilees as a scientific memory of early human population structure. Its value lies in a later historical question. How did an ancient community imagine the relationship between origins, ancestry, and land? The answer seems to involve boundaries that carried memory forward. A territory was not only where descendants lived, it could represent where they were believed to belong. Once that idea is recognized, Eden's place within the larger sacred geography becomes easier to understand. The search is no longer only for a river or mountain. It is also a search for how ancient writers used space to connect beginnings with generations, and how the memory of one protected place could eventually become part of a world divided among many inherited lands. In that world, crossing a border could mean more than changing scenery. It could mean leaving one inherited relationship and entering another, carrying ancestry, obligation, and memory across the landscape with every human movement. By the time Jubilees has divided the world among the descendants of Noah, Eden no longer stands alone in the story of human beginnings. It belongs to a much larger mental map in which sacred places, family lines, inherited territories, and boundaries all help organize the world. This does not mean that the author drew a map in the modern sense. There is no scale, no coordinate grid, and no attempt to describe every region with equal precision. The structure is relational. One place matters because of its connection to another. One territory matters because a particular lineage is associated with it. One boundary matters because crossing it changes the meaning of possession and belonging. Eden fits naturally into this system because it already represents a place set apart from ordinary human space. Earlier, the first humans lived within a garden planted in Eden, and their departure marked a movement from one kind of landscape into another. Later, the descendants of Noah inhabit a world divided among families and generations. The scale has expanded, but the basic principle remains recognizable. Space carries memory. A place is never only ground. It can hold a story about where people came from, what they inherited, and how they are related to those who lived before them. That is why Eden can remain important, even when the narrative has moved far beyond it. It functions as a remembered beginning within a world that has become increasingly complex. Rivers, mountains, territories, and boundaries now surround the memory of that beginning. The result is not a single geographical clue, but a network of relationships. This is especially important for the question behind the title. If we search the Dead Sea Scrolls only for a hidden location, we may miss what texts such as Jubilees actually preserve. They show that some ancient Jewish writers were interested in how human history could be arranged across space. Eden could be sacred, Sinai could be sacred, Zion could be sacred, and the lands of Noah's descendants could carry inherited meaning. These places did not need to occupy the same physical location in order to belong to one ordered world. Their significance came partly from the way they were connected through memory and sacred history. Human societies often build this kind of map without drawing it. A family may remember a village it left generations earlier. A community may define itself through a river, a mountain, or a burial place. A distant homeland can remain central to identity even when most descendants have never seen it. Over time, such memories can organize how people understand movement, loss, belonging, and return. We should not assume that the specific sacred geography of Jubilees reaches back into prehistoric human life. The earliest Homo sapiens left no written descriptions of Eden or inherited divisions of the earth. Their movements are reconstructed through physical evidence, and those movements were often fluid, with populations mixing, separating, and adapting to changing environments. Yet, the later human tendency to connect ancestry with land is historically visible in many societies. Jubilees gives us one clear literary example. Its world is divided among generations, but the remembered center of human beginnings still has a place within that world. Eden therefore becomes easier to understand as part of a larger mental geography. It is not simply a garden waiting to be found between two rivers. It is a place embedded in a system of sacred centers, inherited territories, and boundaries that carry meaning across time. That does not tell us where Eden was. It tells us how one ancient tradition kept Eden present after the story had spread across the entire inhabited world. The geography has become larger, but the beginning has not disappeared. It survives as a reference point inside a landscape shaped by memory, ancestry, and the human need to understand where a story starts before following where its people went. The phrase "east of Eden" is brief, but it changes the direction of the story. After the first humans leave the garden, Genesis places the cherubim to the east of it, guarding the way back to the tree of life. Soon afterward, Cain leaves the presence of the Lord and settles in the land of Nod, described as east of Eden. These references do not provide a map, yet they create a repeated movement away from a remembered center. East becomes part of the geography of separation. The important point is not that every movement toward the east in Genesis has one fixed meaning. Ancient texts can use directions in ordinary geographical ways, and the word itself does not automatically carry a symbolic message. But within the Eden narrative, direction helps the listener imagine that the place of beginning has a boundary and that human life continues beyond it. Once the humans are outside, the landscape is no longer the protected garden. Work, childbirth, family conflict, settlement, and movement take place in a wider world. The geography therefore begins to carry history. A direction becomes connected with generations. The first pair leaves the garden. Cain moves farther away, and later descendants inhabit places that are increasingly distant from the original scene. That sequence does not allow us to calculate where Eden stood. If a text says that one place lies east of another, we still need secure identification of both locations before the information can become useful for modern mapping. In the case of Eden and Nod, neither place can be located with archaeological certainty. The directional clue tells us how the narrative arranges space, not where to place a pin on a map. This distinction matters because directional words can easily be overinterpreted. A reader may see east and begin searching for a line across Mesopotamia, the Caucasus, Arabia, or another region. But one direction without reliable distances, landmarks, or fixed endpoints cannot solve the problem. The safer question is what movement toward the east does inside the story. It marks departure. The first humans lose access to the garden. Cain leaves again and establishes life elsewhere. Human existence becomes increasingly associated with places beyond the remembered origin. That pattern has a quiet resemblance to something visible across much of human history. Communities often carry stories of where earlier generations came from, even after they have moved far away. A homeland can remain important long after most descendants no longer live there. Rivers, mountains, villages, or directions can survive in memory because they help explain where a people believe their story began. We should not project the Eden narrative backward into the biological dispersal of early Homo sapiens. Modern evidence shows that our species emerged through complex population histories, movements, separations, and mixtures over long periods, not through a single migration described in Genesis. Yet, the later human practice of connecting origin with direction is easy to understand. People experience movement through the body. They know when the sun rises on one side of the horizon, when a route leads toward a river, when a mountain remains behind them, and when returning home requires traveling in the opposite direction. Direction becomes memory because journeys are remembered spatially. In Genesis, East of Eden works in that kind of human scale. It places later life somewhere beyond the beginning. The phrase does not reveal Eden's coordinates, but it preserves a relationship between origin and departure. Eden remains behind, guarded and inaccessible, while human history continues outward. That is why the direction matters, even when the map remains uncertain. The story is no longer only about where the first humans once lived. It is also about how generations come to live at a distance from a place they remember as the beginning. From that point onward, geography becomes a way of measuring loss without measuring distance. The farther the narrative moves into families and settlements, the more Eden functions as a remembered point behind them rather than a destination whose road can simply be retraced. Leaving the garden changes more than the setting of the story. It changes the conditions under which human life is imagined. Inside the garden, food is available from trees, Water is present, and the first humans inhabit a place already prepared for them. Outside, the ground becomes harder, work becomes more demanding, and survival is tied more visibly to labor, birth, family, and the uncertain future of later generations. The movement away from Eden is therefore not simply a change of address, it is a transition from a protected center into a landscape where life must be sustained under ordinary limits. Genesis expresses that transition through geography. The humans are sent out, access to the garden is closed. Cain later moves farther away and establishes life in another land. Step by step, the narrative shifts from one bounded place toward a wider inhabited world. This does not mean that Genesis is preserving an eyewitness memory of prehistoric human dispersal. The biological history of Homo sapiens is reconstructed through fossils, archaeology, genetics, and environmental evidence, and it involves complex populations moving and mixing over immense spans of time. The Eden story belongs to a much later literary tradition. Yet, the way it imagines departure remains deeply rooted in human experience. To leave a familiar place is to exchange known resources for uncertain ones. Water may be harder to find, soil may behave differently. Shelter may need to be built rather than assumed. Routes must be learned, seasons observed, and danger recognized. Human communities have faced such problems whenever they entered new environments, whether through migration, seasonal movement, exile, trade, or settlement. The story of Eden places those difficulties into a moral and sacred narrative, but it also gives them physical shape. The world outside the garden has distance, it has direction, it requires effort. That makes the loss of Eden something the body can understand. A place once associated with ease and abundance now lies behind, while the future must be made in ground that demands work. This helps explain why later generations could remember Eden as more than an attractive garden. It becomes a reference point for a different condition of life, one located before hardship, before dispersal, and before the multiplication of human settlements. The contrast is not a scientific account of how agriculture began, and Adam should not be treated as an archaeological farmer. The narrative is expressing a literary vision of human dependence on land. Outside the garden, food comes through effort. Human life is therefore linked more tightly to soil, weather, fertility, and the limits of the environment. That link connects back to the larger question of geography. If Eden marks a center that human beings leave, then its importance is not only where it might have been, but what changes once people are no longer there. A center becomes meaningful because there is an outside. A homeland becomes meaningful because departure is possible. A protected place becomes meaningful because the rest of the world is less protected. In this way, geography begins to organize memory. Eden remains behind as the place of origin, while human history unfolds elsewhere. The farther the story moves into families, settlements, conflict, and new lands, the more Eden functions as a remembered beginning rather than an active destination. That is an important distinction for reading later texts. When ancient Jewish writers place Eden among sacred locations or within larger arrangements of land, they are not necessarily trying to guide travelers back to a lost garden. They may be preserving the idea of a center from which ordinary human history has already moved away. The meaning of Eden can therefore survive even when access to it is gone. Its geography becomes the geography of distance from a beginning. The place remains important because the people do not remain there. And once that pattern is understood, the next question is no longer simply why humans left the center, but how later generations continue to remember a place they could no longer enter. A place can remain important long after the people connected with it have moved away. Families remember villages they no longer inhabit. Communities preserve stories about rivers crossed by earlier generations, and distant homelands can continue to shape identity, even when few descendants have ever seen them. The Eden story develops in a similar direction. Once the first humans leave the garden, the narrative does not return them to it. Cain moves farther away, families multiply, settlements appear, and the remembered place of beginning becomes increasingly distant from the lived world of later generations. Eden remains present not because people continue to live there, but because the story keeps the origin behind them. This is where geography becomes memory. A place no longer needs to be physically accessible in order to remain central to the way a community understands its past. Its meaning can survive through names, directions, stories, and repeated acts of telling. That does not mean we know exactly how ancient Israelites or later Jewish communities imagined the physical location of Eden. Different readers could have understood the story differently, and surviving texts do not give us one uniform map. What we can see is that the narrative allows Eden to function as a remembered point of origin, while human history spreads across other lands. The direction east of Eden reinforces that distance. It tells us that later life unfolds somewhere beyond the beginning, while access to the garden itself is closed. Over generations, such a structure can transform geography into ancestry. The important question becomes not only where a place lies, but how it explains where a people believe their story began. Human societies frequently connect origins with landscape in this way. A mountain may become associated with ancestors. A river may mark an old boundary. A ruined settlement may remain a place of return in memory, even after political or environmental change has altered the surrounding world. These relationships are historically observable in many societies, but we should not assume that the Eden tradition arose from one specific migration memory unless evidence supports that conclusion. The biological history of Homo sapiens is much older and more complex than the literary traditions preserved in Genesis. Populations moved, mixed, separated, and adapted across changing environments for vast periods before writing existed. We cannot recover their thoughts about origin from later sacred texts, yet one broader human pattern is clear. Memory often gives movement a direction. People remember where they came from in relation to where they are now. That relationship can be carried for generations, even when the original landscape changes or becomes unreachable. In the Eden narrative, the garden becomes such a reference point. It is behind the later human world, separated by a boundary that cannot simply be crossed again. The story therefore turns origin into distance. This helps explain why later Jewish writings could continue to place Eden within sacred geography without needing ordinary access to it. A remembered center can remain meaningful precisely because it is no longer part of everyday life. It can anchor a larger map of sacred places, inherited lands, and historical events from outside ordinary experience. This is not evidence that Eden was imaginary, nor is it evidence that it can be located archaeologically. It is evidence that ancient writers could use geography to organize memory. The place of beginning stays fixed in the story while generations move outward. That arrangement allows Eden to carry meaning across time, even when its physical position remains uncertain. For the question behind these texts, this is a crucial shift. The problem is no longer simply whether a river, mountain, or direction can reveal a coordinate. It is also how a place of origin survives after direct access is lost. Eden may remain geographically unresolved, yet still function as a stable point in collective memory. Once geography becomes generational memory, a place can shape people who never stood within it, because what is inherited is not the ground itself, but the story of where everything was believed to have begun. Genesis does not describe the first human as simply resting inside a landscape that provides everything without any relationship to work. The human is placed in the garden to work it and keep it. Those words are important because they complicate the familiar picture of Eden as a place where nothing had to be done. The garden is abundant, but abundance does not mean complete inactivity. It is a cultivated space, and the human is given a role within it. That role should not be confused with modern employment, nor should Adam be turned into an archaeological farmer whose tools, crops, and daily routine can be reconstructed from the text. Genesis gives us no such evidence. What it does give us is a relationship between a person and a place. The garden is something to be tended. The human belongs there not only as a recipient of food, but also as a caretaker within an ordered environment. This makes the geography of Eden more concrete. A place that must be worked and kept is not merely scenery. It has soil, plants, limits, and conditions that require attention. It can flourish, and it can be neglected. The language also helps explain why the later movement outside the garden feels so significant. Work itself is not introduced only after the expulsion. The human already has a task inside Eden. What changes outside is the difficulty of that relationship with the ground. The soil becomes associated with hardship, resistance, and the effort required to produce food. This difference matters because it prevents us from reading Eden as a simple contrast between work and no work. A better contrast is between a protected, ordered relationship with the land and a more difficult one beyond the garden. That distinction would have been understandable in societies where survival depended on knowing how to use land without assuming that the land would always cooperate. Water had to arrive at the right time. Plants had seasons. Fields could fail. Animals moved. Heat, dryness, flood, and disease could alter what a landscape provided. The Genesis story is not a scientific account of how agriculture began, but it speaks through a world in which human life is inseparable from environmental limits. That connection reaches much deeper into human history than agriculture itself. For most of the existence of Homo sapiens, people lived by gathering, hunting, fishing, moving through seasonal territories, and learning where resources could be found. Their lives were not organized around the garden described in Genesis, and we should not project this later literary image backward onto them. Yet, every population depended on sustained attention to place. People had to remember where water remained during dry periods, when plants ripened, where animals traveled, and which environments offered shelter. Human survival has always involved an active relationship with surroundings. In that broad sense, the Eden story places a familiar human reality near the beginning. Life depends on how people inhabit a landscape. The garden is meaningful not because it removes humans from ecology, but because it places them inside an environment that can support them. The command to work and keep it makes that dependence visible. It also changes the way we should think about the word paradise. Later, imagination often turns paradise into effortless abundance, a place where need disappears. Genesis presents something subtler. Food is available, water flows, and the setting is protected, yet the human still has a responsibility toward the place itself. Eden is therefore not merely consumed, it is inhabited. That difference matters for the larger geographical question. If the garden is a tended zone inside Eden, then the story is describing a relationship between human beings and one particular kind of habitable space. The first human origin in the narrative is not placed in empty wilderness or in an abstract heaven. It is placed on ground where water, vegetation, work, and care meet. Before asking where Eden might have been, we have to notice that the story first asks what it meant to live there. A landscape becomes meaningful to human beings only when the body can survive within it. Water must be available often enough to replace what is lost through breathing, heat, and movement. Food must be obtainable without demanding more energy than it provides. Shelter from weather must exist or be created. Temperatures must remain within limits that human bodies can manage through behavior, clothing, fire, shade, or movement. These requirements are basic, and they help explain why the environmental details surrounding Eden feel so immediate, even though the story itself is not a scientific account of human origins. The garden contains water, vegetation, food, and a protected space. Those are also among the conditions that make any landscape more suitable for sustained human occupation, but this similarity must be handled carefully. It does not mean that Genesis preserves a biological memory of one prehistoric refuge. It means that the story is built from environmental realities that human beings everywhere understand through experience. Our bodies are mostly unable to ignore geography. Heat changes how much water we need. Cold increases the importance of shelter and fuel. Dryness limits plant growth. Seasonal rainfall changes when food becomes available. Rivers can concentrate plants, animals, fertile soils, and human movement within narrow corridors. A place that appears empty during one season may become productive during another. Early human populations had to respond to these variations long before written language preserved stories about beginnings. Archaeological and environmental evidence suggests that Homo sapiens lived across changing African landscapes rather than within one permanent ecological setting. Populations adapted to coasts, grasslands, woodlands, lakes, river systems, and other environments at different times and places. Scientists continue to refine the details of that history, so it would be misleading to reduce our species to one simple birthplace landscape or one fixed way of life. The important point is broader. Human survival has always depended on finding combinations of resources that the body can use. Fresh water is especially important because people cannot simply choose to stop needing it. Food sources can vary greatly, but water places a stricter limit on how long individuals can remain far from reliable supplies. Shade can reduce heat stress. Vegetation can provide food, materials, and clues about nearby water. Animals also gather around productive environments, making certain places valuable for hunting or observation. None of these facts identifies Eden. They simply help us see why an ancient story about a place of abundance would naturally emphasize water and plants rather than abstract wealth. Gold may be named in the wider geographical description, but the first humans survive because the garden supports life. The biological body gives that image its quiet realism. A person can possess precious material and still die without water. A beautiful landscape can still be uninhabitable if it provides no food or shelter. A fertile place matters because it reduces some of the pressures that every organism faces. The garden therefore represents something more fundamental than luxury. It is a landscape in which essential needs appear to be met within a bounded area. This helps explain the emotional power of leaving it. Outside the garden, the human relationship with the ground becomes more difficult. Food is still possible, but obtaining it is described as harder. The story turns environmental security into environmental uncertainty. That contrast would remain understandable to people living thousands of years after the earliest Homo sapiens, because the human body had not escaped its dependence on land. Civilizations could build canals, store grain, dig wells, construct walls, and move food over long distances, but none of those innovations removed the basic need for water, energy, and tolerable conditions. They only changed how societies met those needs. Eden can therefore be read as a highly ordered image of habitable space, without claiming that it records a real ecological refuge from deep prehistory. Its rivers, trees, food, and cultivated ground belong to the material vocabulary through which human communities have long understood security. The geographical question becomes more precise when viewed this way. We are not looking for a place merely because ancient people liked beautiful landscapes. We are looking at a tradition in which the beginning of human life is imagined, where the conditions for life are unusually concentrated. Water arrives, plants grow, food is accessible. The ground can be inhabited and cared for. That combination does not reveal where Eden was, but it helps explain why landscapes of abundance became such powerful ways of imagining where human life ought to begin. When human communities tell stories about beginnings, they often give those beginnings a landscape. Origins are placed beside rivers, beneath mountains, inside valleys, near springs, or within cultivated ground. This does not mean that every origin story preserves an exact memory of where a population first emerged. It means that human beings understand existence through places they can imagine with the body. Water can be crossed. Soil can be worked. Trees can give shade. A boundary can be entered or left behind. These physical features make questions about origin feel concrete. The Eden story follows that pattern. Human life begins not in empty space, but in a setting defined by water, vegetation, food, direction, and separation from the world outside. For ancient societies, landscapes were not simply backgrounds, they stored memory. A river could mark a route associated with ancestors. A hill could preserve a burial place, a field could remain connected to a family long after individual lives ended. A boundary could separate groups and become part of the story of who belonged where. Over generations, such associations could be repeated through names, rituals, law, and inherited narratives. This is one reason sacred geography can endure even when a place is distant. The place continues to organize memory because it represents an origin, a loss, or a relationship. Eden works similarly within traditions that grew around Genesis. The garden is remembered as a place of first habitation, but its meaning expands as later texts connect beginnings with holy places, territories, and inherited lands. That development does not prove that Eden was once an archaeological site. It shows how landscape can become a container for collective memory. The distinction is essential. Archaeology can recover settlements, tools, plant remains, animal bones, and traces of changing environments. Genetics can reveal relationships among populations. Geology can reconstruct ancient rivers and climates. None of those methods confirms that a landscape was the Eden of Genesis. Literary traditions give us a different kind of evidence. They show how communities imagined the past and connected human life to meaningful places. Both forms of evidence are valuable, but they answer different questions. For the deep history of Homo sapiens, environments mattered because bodies needed water, food, shelter, and tolerable conditions. For later cultural memory, those same elements could become signs of order, abundance, danger, or loss. A spring was still a spring, but it could also become sacred. A mountain was still rock and elevation, but it could become a place where revelation was remembered. A garden was still cultivated land, but it could also become an image of human life before exile. The power of such images comes from the overlap between physical experience and memory. People know what thirst feels like, what shade feels like, what dry ground looks like, and what it means to leave a familiar place. When a story uses rivers, trees, and boundaries, it speaks through experiences that remain understandable across generations. This helps explain why Eden has remained persistent in cultural memory. Its power does not depend on our being able to locate it on a map. The story presents a place where essential conditions for life are concentrated, then describes the loss of access to that place. That movement turns geography into memory. The garden becomes more than a setting because the people who leave it cannot simply return. Human life unfolds elsewhere, while the beginning remains behind. This prepares an important correction before attention moves closer to the Dead Sea. The fact that ancient manuscripts survived in a particular desert does not mean the landscapes described inside them were believed to be located there. A place of preservation and a place of memory are not the same thing. Understanding why humans imagine beginnings through landscapes allows us to keep those questions separate, and that separation is necessary if the search for Eden is to remain grounded in evidence. The desert around the Dead Sea creates an atmosphere that can easily mislead the imagination. Pale cliffs rise above a dry landscape, caves open in the rock, and ancient manuscripts survived there for centuries before being recovered in the modern era. Because those manuscripts contain biblical texts and other Jewish writings about the distant past, it can be tempting to treat the place where they were found as part of the geography described inside them. But those are two different questions. The Qumran caves tell us where manuscripts were stored, hidden, abandoned, or preserved. They do not automatically tell us where the stories copied on those manuscripts were believed to have happened. This distinction is especially important for Eden. The Dead Sea Scrolls include manuscripts from caves near Qumran, as well as material discovered at other sites in the Judean desert. The Qumran collection preserves biblical writings alongside many non-biblical compositions. Their survival depended partly on the environmental conditions of the region and on the circumstances that placed them inside caves, but the subjects they discuss extend far beyond the desert around the Dead Sea. A manuscript of Genesis found near Qumran does not relocate the Tigris or Euphrates to that landscape. A copy of Jubilees preserved in a cave does not prove that the sacred places it describes were nearby. The physical location of a text and the geographical world within a text must be kept separate. Archaeologists make similar distinctions. Whenever written material is recovered far from the places it describes, a document can travel. A book can be copied in one region from a tradition associated with another. A community can preserve stories about lands its members have never visited. Human beings have carried texts, names, memories, and sacred traditions across enormous distances throughout recorded history. The place where an object survives is therefore part of its archaeological history, not necessarily the origin of every idea contained within it. This becomes easier to understand if we return to the human experience of landscape. People have always moved through environments while carrying memories of other places. A family can live beside one river while telling stories about another. A community can inhabit a desert while praying about a distant city. A manuscript copied in one settlement can describe mountains, kingdoms, and ancestral lands far beyond the horizon. None of this is unusual. What makes the Dead Sea Scrolls remarkable is not that their discovery site secretly identifies the places in their stories, but that their preservation gives us access to ancient forms of those stories and to the ways they were interpreted. The Judean desert becomes important as the landscape that protected evidence. It should not be confused with the landscape that every piece of that evidence describes. This is also where the search for Eden requires restraint. The Dead Sea itself, the cliffs around Qumran, and the dry valleys nearby can look dramatically different from the green image usually associated with Eden. That contrast may invite imaginative theories about environmental change, lost rivers, or a vanished paradise. Environmental change is real, and ancient landscapes can differ greatly from modern ones, but a general fact about changing climates cannot establish that Eden once stood near Qumran. Such a claim would require independent evidence connecting the textual geography to that specific region. The scrolls do not supply that connection merely by being found there. For the history of human origins, the same principle applies. Archaeological remains must be interpreted according to their context, and later, stories cannot simply be moved backward into prehistory because they were discovered near an ancient site. Evidence gains meaning from careful separation before comparison. The caves near the Dead Sea preserve one layer of history, the history of manuscripts, communities, and transmission. Eden belongs to another question: how ancient texts imagine the place of human beginning. Keeping those layers distinct may feel less dramatic than declaring that the desert hides the entrance to Eden, but it brings us closer to what the surviving evidence can actually support. Finding an ancient manuscript in a particular place tells us something important about the history of that object, but it does not automatically tell us where the story inside it began. This distinction may seem obvious, yet it becomes easy to forget when the object itself is dramatic. The Dead Sea Scrolls survived in caves along the western side of the Dead Sea, especially near Qumran, and the dry environment helped preserve material that might otherwise have disappeared. That archaeological setting is part of the history of the manuscripts. It tells us where fragments were recovered, how they survived, and sometimes something about the people who stored, copied, carried, or used them. But a manuscript can describe places far from where it was found. A copy of Genesis discovered in the Judean desert contains traditions that refer to Mesopotamian rivers. A manuscript of Jubilees preserved near Qumran can describe Sinai, Zion, Eden, and territories extending across a much wider imagined world. The cave does not pull those places toward itself. The place of preservation and the place described by a text are different categories of evidence. This is a basic principle in historical work because written objects travel. They can be copied from older exemplars, carried by merchants, refugees, scribes, pilgrims, soldiers, or religious communities, and preserved far from the regions mentioned in their contents. Even when a manuscript was copied locally, the tradition it preserves may have developed elsewhere or may describe events understood to belong to a distant past. For Eden, this distinction protects us from a particularly tempting mistake. Because the scrolls were found near the Dead Sea, one might imagine that their geographical language somehow points back toward the same desert. The contrast is visually powerful. Dry cliffs surrounding a body of salt water seem almost opposite to the watered garden of Genesis. It is easy to build a dramatic theory from that contrast, perhaps suggesting that climate change transformed paradise into desert, or that a vanished river system once connected Eden directly to the Dead Sea. Ancient environments certainly changed, and rivers can shift or disappear, but those general facts do not establish a connection to Eden. A hypothesis needs evidence that links a particular landscape to the particular tradition being investigated. The location of a manuscript alone cannot provide that link. Human history makes this easier to understand. People have always carried memories beyond the places where those memories began. A family may preserve the name of a village after moving hundreds of kilometers away. A displaced community may continue to describe a homeland for generations. Sacred texts can be copied in one country while speaking repeatedly about another. The physical object belongs to the place where it was made, used, stored, or found, while the story can belong to a different geographical horizon entirely. The same separation is necessary when thinking about deep human origins. Archaeologists distinguish where an artifact is recovered from what that artifact can actually demonstrate about past movement and behavior. One object rarely proves an entire migration story. Context matters, and different lines of evidence must agree before a large conclusion becomes secure. The Dead Sea Scrolls should be approached with the same discipline. Their caves give us archaeological context. Their handwriting, materials, languages, and textual forms give us other kinds of information. Their descriptions of Eden and sacred geography give us evidence for ancient interpretation. None of those layers should silently replace another. Once they are kept separate, the scrolls become more useful, not less. We can ask what ancient readers believed about Eden without pretending that Qumran was Eden. We can examine how sacred space was organized without turning the Judean desert into a hidden coordinate. Preservation tells us where a text survived. Provenance may tell us something about where an object was produced or circulated when that can be established. The story inside it may point somewhere else again. Keeping those distances visible is one of the simplest ways to prevent a compelling landscape from becoming false evidence. The most important clue in any historical investigation is sometimes the limit of what the evidence can support. In the case of Eden and the Dead Sea Scrolls, that limit is clear. The manuscripts do not contain a verified map leading to Eden. They do not provide coordinates, measured distances, or a route that can be followed from Qumran to a lost garden. They do not identify an archaeological site as the home of Adam and Eve, and the caves in which the scrolls survived do not establish that the events described in Genesis took place near the Dead Sea. These statements may sound less exciting than claims about hidden geography, but they are essential if the story is to remain historically honest. Ancient texts can preserve real place names, real rivers, inherited traditions, and meaningful descriptions of landscape without giving modern readers enough information to identify one precise location. That is exactly the situation we face with Eden. The Tigris and Euphrates offer recognizable anchors, while Pishon and Gihon remain uncertain. Jubilees preserves a sacred geography in which Eden stands in relation to other holy places, but that relationship is not a survey. The Qumran manuscripts show that such ideas were copied and circulated, but circulation is not proof of location. Archaeology adds another boundary. The Judean desert contains ancient settlements, roads, caves, pottery, structures, and other remains that can be studied within their own historical contexts. Those remains can tell us about communities that lived or traveled in the region during particular periods. They cannot be connected to Eden merely because manuscripts mentioning ancient traditions were found nearby. Archaeological identification requires more than proximity. It depends on context, dating, material remains, and evidence that can be compared with independent sources. No accepted archaeological discovery from Qumran or the surrounding Dead Sea region demonstrates that the Garden of Eden stood there, nor has archaeology identified a site that can be securely called the residence of the first human pair described in Genesis. This is also where the difference between sacred tradition and biological human origins must remain visible. Homo sapiens emerged through a long evolutionary history reconstructed from fossils, genetics, archaeology, and environmental evidence. Science does not identify a single historical couple from whom all modern humans descend in the simple way a literal reading of Adam and Eve might suggest. Genesis belongs to an ancient literary and religious tradition about human beginnings. Its value does not depend on turning its characters into objects that archaeology must locate. The Dead Sea Scrolls, in turn, help us understand how later Jewish communities preserved and interpreted such traditions. Their value lies in that historical window. Once this is understood, uncertainty stops being a weakness. It becomes part of responsible interpretation. We can say that some ancient writers imagined Eden as a sacred place. We can say that rivers, lands, mountains, and boundaries helped organize the geography of human beginnings in their texts. We can compare those descriptions with known landscapes and with other ancient traditions. But when the evidence stops, the conclusion must stop with it. A dried riverbed is not Pishon simply because a theory needs one. A mountain is not Eden simply because sacred mountains are common. A cave near the Dead Sea is not a gateway to paradise simply because ancient manuscripts survived inside it. Each claim requires its own support. This discipline protects the story from becoming less interesting, not more. When invented, certainty is removed, a more meaningful question remains. The scrolls may not reveal where Eden was, but they do reveal how ancient people placed human beginnings inside a world of geography, memory, holiness, and inherited space. That is a historical discovery we can actually defend, because it rests on surviving texts rather than on conclusions added after them. And it is strong enough to carry the investigation forward without pretending that the missing evidence has already been found. Mesopotamia is the first region many modern readers think of when the rivers of Eden are placed on a map, and the reason is easy to understand. Genesis names the Tigris and Euphrates, two great rivers associated with the lands that later Greek writers called Mesopotamia, the broad region between and around those waterways. For thousands of years, communities along these river systems built settlements, cultivated fields, moved goods, and developed some of the earliest urban societies known from written history. The names therefore pull the Eden story toward a real geographical world. They make the landscape feel less abstract than it would if all four rivers were unknown. Yet two familiar names are not enough to locate the beginning of the story. The Tigris and Euphrates rise in upland regions to the north, follow separate courses through large territories, and approach one another much farther downstream. Their modern relationship does not reproduce a simple picture of one river leaving a single place and then dividing neatly into four major rivers. The landscape has also changed over long periods as channels shifted, sediment accumulated, coastlines moved, and human societies altered the flow of water. None of these changes proves that the river system of Genesis once existed in exactly the form described. They simply remind us that modern geography cannot be assumed to preserve every ancient feature unchanged. Mesopotamia remains important because it offers two recognizable anchors, but an anchor is not a solution. The other river names, Pishon and Gihon, still resist identification that scholars broadly accept. The lands associated with them are also difficult to place with confidence. This means that any reconstruction beginning with the Tigris and Euphrates soon encounters uncertainty. A theory may fit two names while requiring the other two to be moved, renamed, reinterpreted, or connected through ancient channels that cannot be securely identified with the biblical rivers. At that point, the difference between possibility and proof becomes essential. A possible landscape can help us ask questions. It cannot be treated as the recovered location of Eden. Mesopotamia also attracts attention for another reason. Its river plains supported dense human settlement, irrigation, agriculture, cities, temples, and written traditions over long periods. For later readers, it can therefore seem like an intuitive setting for a story concerned with rivers, cultivated ground, and the beginnings of ordered human life. But that intuition can become misleading if we confuse cultural importance with evidence of origin. Genesis is not an archaeological report describing the first farmers or the first cities. The biological beginnings of Homo sapiens are far older and are reconstructed primarily from evidence in Africa and from later population movements across other regions. The world of Mesopotamian civilization belongs to a much later chapter of human history. Still, the environmental logic of the region helps us understand why rivers carried such power in ancient thought. Waterways could sustain fields, connect settlements, and turn otherwise difficult landscapes into places where large populations could live. A story that imagines human beginnings beside flowing water therefore speaks through conditions that ancient listeners understood directly. The crucial discipline is to let that context illuminate the text without forcing the text into one location. Mesopotamia may be part of the geographical horizon behind the Eden tradition, especially because the Tigris and Euphrates are explicitly named, but the surviving evidence does not allow us to say that Eden has been found there. The two rivers open a door toward a plausible region. Pishon, Gihon, the structure of the fourfold river system, and the absence of a securely identifiable garden prevent that door from becoming a final destination. What Mesopotamia gives us is not Eden itself, but the strongest reminder so far that the story deliberately touches a landscape ancient people knew as part of the real world. That limited conclusion is less dramatic than a pinpointed map, but it preserves the difference between what the ancient description genuinely gives us and what modern reconstruction merely hopes to recover. Once Mesopotamia becomes the starting point for modern reconstruction, the search often moves in two opposite directions. Some readers look north toward the uplands where the Tigris and Euphrates rise. Others look south toward the low plains and former wetlands where the two rivers approach one another before reaching the Persian Gulf. Both directions begin from real geography, and both can seem persuasive for different reasons. The northern approach emphasizes sources. If a river flows out from Eden and then becomes several waterways, a highland setting may appear attractive because major rivers often begin in elevated regions. The upper courses of the Tigris and Euphrates lie near mountainous terrain, and several ancient rivers originate across the broader uplands of eastern Anatolia and neighboring regions. Yet the biblical description does not say that Eden was located at the headwaters of these two rivers, and it does not identify a mountain range. Matching the idea of a source with high ground is therefore a geographical inference, not a textual conclusion. The southern approach begins from a different observation. Rivers can join, divide into distributaries, change channels, and create marshes or deltas in lowlands. Southern Mesopotamia has experienced substantial environmental change over long periods, including shifting river courses and changing wetlands. This has encouraged some modern proposals that look toward the lower Tigris-Euphrates system rather than their northern sources. But, here again, a changing ancient river landscape does not identify Eden. Geological evidence can show that a channel once existed, or that a wetland expanded and contracted. It cannot tell us that an ancient watercourse carried the name Pishon or Gihon unless other evidence connects the two. The same problem appears in proposals involving ancient channels elsewhere in Arabia or surrounding regions. Remote sensing and geological research can reveal former drainage systems beneath landscapes that are dry today. Such discoveries are valuable for reconstructing past environments and human movement, but a vanished river becomes part of the Eden question only when the textual and geographical evidence can be joined securely. Similar shape is not enough. Neither is proximity to a land that someone wishes to identify with Havilah or Cush. This is where modern maps can create an illusion of certainty. A line can be drawn between any number of ancient channels, mountains, and known rivers. Once the line is visible, the arrangement can feel discovered rather than constructed. Yet, every connection must still be justified independently. Human beings have repeatedly occupied river corridors because water concentrates resources and makes travel and settlement possible. Early populations also moved through landscapes very different from those visible today, as climates changed and lakes, grasslands, and drainage systems expanded or contracted. Those facts help archaeologists reconstruct human environments, but they do not convert the Eden narrative into a prehistoric migration map. The origin of Homo sapiens is studied through a much older body of evidence, and no accepted scientific model links our species' emergence to the four rivers of Genesis. What the competing Eden proposals reveal most clearly is the difficulty of moving from an ancient literary description to a modern location. The northern highlands may seem to fit the idea of river sources. The southern plains may seem to fit changing channels and branching waters. Other proposals may identify old riverbeds or reinterpret ancient place names. Each can illuminate one feature while leaving another unresolved. That is why a plausible region must remain different from a proven location. Geography can narrow questions, but it cannot erase uncertainty. The more possible landscapes we examine, the clearer one principle becomes. A theory is strongest not when it explains one striking clue, but when it accounts for all the evidence without requiring uncertain names, missing rivers, and later assumptions to behave as though they were established facts. Eden still resists that standard, and the resistance itself tells us how carefully the final comparison must be made before any candidate region is allowed to become a supposed answer. The strongest geographical theories about Eden often begin with something real. A known river, an ancient channel, a mountain range, a historical place name, or a landscape changed by climate can provide a legitimate starting point. The difficulty begins when several uncertain clues are combined and the result is presented as certainty. A region may resemble part of the description in Genesis without being the place that the text calls Eden. This difference between plausibility and proof is one of the most important distinctions in historical reasoning. A plausible region is one that fits some of the surviving evidence. A proven location would require several independent lines of evidence to converge in a way that leaves little reasonable doubt. For Eden, that standard has not been reached. The Tigris and Euphrates can be identified, but Pishon and Gihon remain uncertain. Ancient place names such as Havilah and Cush cannot be converted into fixed modern borders with complete confidence. River systems have changed, and later texts interpret sacred geography in ways that do not function like modern surveys. These problems do not make geographical investigation useless. They simply place limits on what conclusions can responsibly be drawn. Archaeology works in a similar way. Finding a settlement beside an ancient river can establish that people lived there at a certain time. Plant remains can show what they cultivated or gathered. Animal bones can reveal part of their diet. Sediments can preserve evidence of flooding, drought, or changing water conditions. But none of those discoveries becomes evidence for Eden unless there is an additional connection to the tradition itself. A fertile site is not automatically the garden. An ancient river is not automatically one of the four rivers. A place occupied very early in human history is not automatically the birthplace described by a much later sacred narrative. The same discipline applies to written evidence. A text can tell us that an ancient writer believed a place was holy, central, or connected to human beginnings. It does not automatically prove that the writer possessed accurate geographical knowledge inherited unchanged from deep prehistory. Human memory can preserve remarkable information, but it can also transform places as stories pass through generations. Names shift, meanings expand, and landscapes become symbols of identity. That process is not deception. It is one of the normal ways cultures remember the past. The biological history of Homo sapiens reminds us why these distinctions matter. Our species did not emerge through one simple event that can be matched to a single later story. Current evidence points to complex population histories in Africa, followed by movements, interactions, and dispersals over long periods. Those conclusions come from fossils, genetics, archaeology, and environmental research. They answer a different question from the one ancient writers were asking when they spoke about Eden. The two histories can be studied beside one another, but they should not be forced into a false agreement. Once this separation is maintained, the geography clues become easier to evaluate. Mesopotamia may be relevant because two rivers are named. Northern highlands may be worth considering because great rivers have sources there. Southern plains and vanished channels may matter because river landscapes change. Yet every proposal still encounters unresolved evidence. None has produced a location that can be demonstrated in the way an excavated ancient city can sometimes be identified through inscriptions, continuous occupation, and independent historical records. That does not require us to abandon the search. It requires us to describe its status accurately. Eden remains a textual and historical geography problem with several possible regional connections, not a recovered archaeological address, and that distinction finally brings us back to the Dead Sea Scrolls. Their most useful contribution is not a coordinate that everyone overlooked. It is evidence that some ancient Jewish readers understood Eden inside a larger world of sacred centers, territories, boundaries, mountains, rivers, and remembered beginnings. The question now is not whether the scrolls secretly solve the map, But what changes when we return to the first line of Genesis, knowing that the garden was placed in Eden, rather than simply being Eden itself? After following rivers, mountains, boundaries, inherited lands, and the sacred geography preserved in later Jewish writings, it is useful to return to the first description of Eden and read it again with greater care. Genesis does not begin by saying that Eden itself was planted. It says that a garden was planted in Eden. That distinction, almost invisible in ordinary speech, now carries more weight. If the garden is located within Eden, then Eden is conceptually larger than the cultivated space where the first humans are placed. The text does not tell us how much larger. It does not describe borders around Eden or provide a distance from the garden to the lands beyond it. But it gives us enough to avoid treating the two terms as exact synonyms. The river strengthens the same impression. Water is said to flow out of Eden to water the garden and then continue into a wider network. Eden therefore functions as more than the interior of an enclosed paradise. It belongs to a larger spatial setting from which water moves, while the garden occupies one ordered place within that setting. Seen this way, the famous question, "Where was the Garden of Eden?" may be narrower than the ancient description itself. Before locating the garden, we would first need to understand what Eden meant as a larger place in the narrative. Yet that is where the evidence becomes uncertain. Genesis names rivers and lands but does not give the measurements needed for reconstruction. Later writings, such as Jubilees, place Eden inside a sacred order of holy locations, but they do not supply modern coordinates either. What they add is not a missing roadmap. They add evidence about how Eden could be imagined as part of a wider world. This changes the question without solving it. Eden can be geographically meaningful even when its location remains unresolved. The garden can be physically described within the story while still carrying sacred significance. A river can resemble real geography while also helping organize a remembered beginning. Ancient texts often allow physical place and religious meaning to exist together. Human beings themselves live that way. A river can be measurable water and also the boundary of a homeland. A mountain can be geological rock and also the place where a community remembers revelation. A garden can be cultivated land and also an image of ordered life. This overlap helps explain why Eden has remained difficult to reduce to a single modern category. For the biological history of Homo sapiens, there is no evidence that our species began in the Garden of Eden described by Genesis. Human origins are reconstructed through fossils, genetics, archaeology, and changing environments, and they reveal a complex population history far older than these written traditions. But the Eden narrative tells us something different about later human attempts to imagine beginnings. It places origins somewhere. It gives that place water, vegetation, direction, and boundaries. It then describes the loss of access to the cultivated center while preserving the larger name of Eden in memory. That pattern may be why the distinction between Eden and the garden matters so much. The garden is the place inhabited and then lost. Eden is the wider geographical name that remains around the memory of that loss. We cannot know from the text alone whether ancient authors imagined Eden as a broad region, a sacred zone, or another kind of geographical entity with clear physical boundaries. The safest conclusion is smaller. The wording leaves room for Eden to be larger than the garden. Once that is recognized, the Dead Sea Scrolls become more interesting for what they truly preserve. They show that later Jewish readers could place Eden within networks of holy places, inherited territories, and sacred geography without handing us a hidden coordinate. The garden has simply returned to its original scale as one place inside a larger landscape whose full shape the surviving evidence no longer allows us to see. The Dead Sea Scrolls do not change the Eden story by revealing a missing coordinate. Their importance is more subtle. They show that, in the centuries before and around the beginning of the Common Era, Jewish readers could preserve the familiar language of Genesis while also placing Eden inside a wider system of sacred space. That wider system does not erase the garden. It gives the garden relationships. Eden can stand beside other holy places, be described in language associated with sanctity, and appear within a world whose territories, mountains, boundaries, and inherited lands all carry meaning. This matters because it changes what we should expect from a geographical clue. A clue does not have to be a direction that leads to a point on a map. It can also reveal how a community organized space in its imagination. The manuscripts from Qumran preserve copies of Genesis, but they also preserve works such as Jubilees and the Genesis Apocryphon, texts that show inherited stories being retold, expanded, and arranged in new ways. Those writings do not form one unified commentary, and they should not be treated as though every ancient Jewish reader understood Eden identically. What they give us is evidence of interpretive possibilities. In Jubilees, Eden is not reduced to ordinary cultivated ground. It participates in a pattern of holiness that also includes places such as Sinai and Zion. The relationship among these places does not prove that they were physically close. It shows that geography could carry theological rank as well as physical position. A place might matter because of what happened there, who was associated with it, or how it related to the story of a people. Once that is understood, the phrase geography clues begins to mean something broader and more historically useful. The scrolls do not tell us Eden was here. They help us see that ancient readers could ask a different question. Where does Eden belong within the ordered world of sacred memory? That question is less dramatic, but it is supported by surviving texts. It also helps explain why later attempts to locate Eden solely through rivers can feel incomplete. Rivers are part of the description, but they are not the whole geography. Boundaries, inherited lands, holy centers, and remembered directions also shape the way place functions in these traditions. Human communities often organize memory through exactly this combination. A homeland may be remembered through a river and also through the ancestors connected with it. A mountain may be important because of its physical prominence and because a foundational event is believed to have occurred there. A boundary may describe territory while also expressing who belongs inside it. None of these relationships changes the measurable earth, but they change the way people inhabit that earth mentally and socially. We should still keep this cultural geography separate from the biological origins of Homo sapiens. The scrolls were written and copied enormously later than the emergence of our species. They cannot preserve a direct scientific record of the first human populations. Their evidence belongs to the history of ideas, texts, communities, and memory. That is precisely why they are valuable. They allow us to see how later people gave human beginnings a place within an ordered world. The change they bring is therefore not a new Eden, but a wider Eden. The garden remains inside Eden, while Eden itself can be understood within networks of holiness, ancestry, territory, and sacred memory. What disappeared from modern popular imagination may not be a hidden location at all. It may be the larger spatial framework that ancient readers once saw around the garden. The scrolls cannot restore that framework completely, and they cannot prove how the earliest form of the tradition was understood, but they show enough to correct one assumption. Eden was not necessarily imagined only as a fenced paradise of trees. In some ancient Jewish interpretation, it belonged to a much larger geography of meaning. When a place can no longer be reached, what survives is often not the ground itself, but the meaning attached to it. Eden has endured in that way for centuries. The garden remains vivid because it gathers together things human beings immediately understand: water, food, shelter, order, belonging, and the loss of a place that once seemed secure. Yet, the surviving texts remind us that Eden was never only a beautiful enclosure. Genesis places a garden in Eden. A river moves from Eden through the garden and then outward. Later, Jewish writings preserve Eden within wider patterns of sacred places, inherited lands, mountains, and boundaries. The Dead Sea Scrolls do not solve that geography, but they help us see how much larger the ancient mental landscape could be than the simplified image carried by the phrase Garden of Eden. That may be the most useful lesson of the search. Historical evidence does not become stronger when uncertainty is removed by imagination. It becomes stronger when different kinds of evidence are allowed to remain different. A manuscript can tell us what a writer or community preserved, copied, or interpreted. Archaeology can tell us about material remains, settlement, tools, food, and environmental conditions. Geology can reconstruct ancient rivers and changing landscapes. Genetics and fossils can help reconstruct the biological history of Homo sapiens. None of these methods should be made to answer a question it cannot support. A sacred text is not a satellite map. A dried riverbed is not automatically a biblical river. A place that was once green is not automatically a lost paradise. And a tradition about human beginnings is not, by itself, a scientific record of the emergence of our species. Keeping those distinctions clear does not diminish the story. It allows us to appreciate what the story can genuinely preserve. Ancient people understood that life depended on geography. Water had to arrive, ground had to support food, routes had to be remembered. Boundaries could protect, divide, or define belonging. Generations could move away from a homeland while continuing to carry its name. In that sense, Eden belongs to a very old human habit, placing beginnings somewhere. Long before modern coordinates, people understood the world through rivers, mountains, seasons, distances, and memories of where others had lived before them. Written traditions later gave those relationships enduring form. Some places became centers. Others became borders. Some were associated with ancestors, revelation, loss, or return. Eden became the place behind ordinary human history, remembered even after the narrative had moved outward into families, settlements, territories, and nations. The Dead Sea Scrolls allow us to see one stage in that long history of interpretation. They show that some ancient Jewish readers did not reduce Eden to a single garden surrounded by trees. In writings such as Jubilees, Eden could belong within a larger sacred order. That does not tell us where to excavate. It tells us how space itself could carry meaning. The lesson reaches beyond Eden. Whenever we encounter an ancient claim, the careful question is not only whether it sounds possible, but what kind of evidence would be required to support it. We can compare texts with geography without confusing resemblance with proof. We can explore hypotheses without turning them into facts. We can acknowledge that ancient writers preserved real places while also organizing those places through theology, memory, and inherited identity. This way of reading protects history from becoming a collection of dramatic claims that cannot be tested. It also respects ancient texts by taking their world seriously on its own terms. Eden may never be recoverable as a verified archaeological location, and the Dead Sea Scrolls do not give us permission to pretend otherwise. What they offer is quieter, evidence that ancient readers placed the beginning of humanity inside a landscape of water, holiness, memory, and distance. And the question that remains is whether Eden was ever meant to give us a recoverable location, or to preserve a deeper human need to place beginnings somewhere in the world.